All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this training session brought to you by the Society of American Archivists, Archivists of Religious Collections section. My name is Jacob Griffith Rosenberger. I'm the archivist at the Rye Historical Society in Rye, New York. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land now known as Rye, New York, lies in the traditional territory of the Lenape, Wappinger, and Skygakoke peoples. Rye is specifically associated with the Siwanoy, Munsee speakers that formed a western band of the Wappinger Confederacy. We honor their stewardship of this land in the past, present, and future. We respect the enduring relationships that exist between indigenous nations, peoples, and the land now known as Rye, and we recognize that it is our responsibility to the present and future to embrace our past. So today's topic is outreach lesson planning. Before I introduce our presenter, let's review the disclaimer on the screen. The content in these presentations is for information only and is not legal advice. Our views do not represent the organizations where we work. We do not make any endorsements or guarantees. We're not liable for any loss or damage caused by your use of the content we provide, and it is your responsibility to critically evaluate the content being provided in the presentation or any accompanying materials. Also, please remember the point shown on this second slide. You will not be able to use your microphone or video during this session. You can click on the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen, and under live transcript, click enable auto transcription to get closed captioning. There will be a question period after the presentation concludes. You should use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. We won't have time to monitor the chat, so we will not answer questions in the chat or unmute attendees due to time constraints. Please be respectful in your interactions. We expect you to follow the SAA Code of Conduct. And this session will be recorded. Please fill out the short survey after the session ends. And we encourage you to join the Society of American Archivists if you're not a member. We thank the Congregation of the Sisters of St. Joseph in Canada for hosting this webinar. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Scott Keefer. Scott has been the Provincial Archivist for the Daughters of Charity Province of St. Louise in Emmitsburg, Maryland since 2018. Prior to that, he held positions with the government of Fairfax County, Virginia, Brooklyn College, the American Academy of Rome office in New York, and the American Museum of Natural History. Welcome and thank you, Scott.
Thank you very much. Give me a second here to hope this works. Did I do it right? We good, Jake?
Yes, it looks great.
Fantastic. I should also point out that giving this talk from Emmitsburg, Maryland, I'm located on the historic homeland of the Piscataway Nation. Thank you very much for that introduction. I would like to talk today about planning and crafting lessons for teaching sessions in the archives, and particularly with religious collections. Teaching sessions are valuable ways of outreach in order to fulfill the mandate that archives exist to be used. Teaching advances education in both a subject matter and in primary source use and literacy, a skill that many students of any age bracket do not learn in any stage of education unless they take the initiative themselves or go through trial and error. You know, think back to when you yourself first walked into an archive. If it was as a researcher, had you had any real or practical instruction on what to expect? I know that I certainly didn't, and I don't quite know that that has changed a whole lot, unfortunately. Education is important for religious archives as part of their mandate to have a place in the world. I pulled this quote from back in the mid-1980s, around the time of the turning and rising point of so many religious archives. I know my institution traces its origin to that time period, and I'm sure many of yours do too. Scholars should remember to consult such religious archival collections as they conduct research, but more important, religious archivists should learn to promote their collections to secular historians who stand to benefit from this largely untapped load of information. This is a reminder that I keep coming back to, that the religious and secular worlds, at least in terms of archives, are in fact intertwined. And that as much as our collections reflect a belief in a world beyond this one, they also exist in this one as well. It is important to note that religious archives can be used as teaching tools for your own individual faith communities, but it is absolutely not a necessity. and I hope we are all aware of the reach and purpose of our community and congregational archives for research in a wide range of subjects. There are a few things to consider before jumping in for a teaching project. How much access to original documents are you going to use rather than reproductions? What is the time investment you are able to make for setting up partnerships and planning lessons versus all of your other tasks? How do the ongoing effects of COVID change how you will teach? And will teaching be done in person or done virtually, among many others? Above all other things, and beyond all questions, the biggest piece of advice that I want to give is that, I assure you, on a personal level, teaching is within your reach. I'm not saying this with reference to institutional constraints, the things like time and money and facilities. You know your situation far better than I do on that front. But on a personal level, teaching is actually a skill that can be refined and learned, especially if you're creating teaching sessions that can be engaging for your students. I'm going to talk here a lot about my experience. My first real teaching experience came with middle schoolers. And when I was approached with the question of, do you want to teach middle schoolers? Just that was such a mind-boggling sensation that I had to get over for a second. And eventually it is something that I became comfortable with, which is kind of shocking, but if I can do it, I assure you, you can too. My own story here. I am the Provincial Archivist for the Daughters of Charity, which is a community of Catholic sisters in Emmitsburg, Maryland. The archive is located on the campus of the National Shrine of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, who is the first recognized Catholic saint from the United States. The campus contains a basilica, historic homes, the archive, of course, and a museum about the life of St. Elizabeth. And if you go to that photo on the left there, the pointy building with the round circle, that's the basilica. The archive is in the low wing that is right up, I guess, perpendicular there. In 2019, a member of the museum's interpretive staff came to me to discuss a junior history interpreter, or JHI program, that they were starting. The goal was to teach children about historical interpretation through training and first-person immersion. At this point, the age range of the JHI students was middle schoolers. The program extended over the course of an academic school year, and within the syllabus and schedule of the program, the interpretive staff were asking the archives to show some materials to the JHI students related to their different lessons and topics. The sessions occurred once per month during the school year, and each session lasted for either 60 or 90 minutes. The first year was a pilot program all around, archive front and interpreter front. Nonetheless, there was a schedule with some delineated topics and requests for either specific materials or at least materials related to a general theme or subject, which is a good place to start and is a good place to begin in your collaboration and discussion with teaching partners. Over the first year of the program, the typical session in the archive functioned as a show and tell, where I would pull a few relevant books, documents, or artifacts, point out a few features, and maybe then throw in a few group questions. And just as a sidebar, the image there, that is my primary collaborator's name is Bridget. This is her whiteboard sort of sketching things out. You can see some of her disparate thoughts that she sent. How can we use, can't read that, something's in the way. How can we use how can we use this to reach people of different backgrounds, sense of place, thought linking, senses activity. And I'm thinking on the left, there's etiquette, something in maybe coaching. I'm not quite sure. While a good number of the early show and tell sessions seemed to attract interest in the moment, as the lessons went on, I was increasingly dissatisfied and wanted to create both a better experience for the students and for my own investment of time. Speaking with another archivist later on about teaching experiences, this archivist said a line in relation to show and tell sessions that really, really stuck with me and that I sort of retroactively put to those early sessions. The line went, "There is no latitudinal retention whatsoever, period, with regards to show and tell sessions." And that's just something that really, really stuck with me for a long, long time. It still sticks to me now. With that in mind, I started down the pathway to learning about teaching and finding out some educational theory, which led me to some of the work that SAA has already done on the topic. The Guidelines for Primary Source Literacy project came to completion in 2018. It was a joint project of SAA, RBMS, and ACRL. You can snap a picture of this if you'd like, but I'm going to have this referenced later on, so that link will be back if you don't get a chance right now. The purpose of the guidelines was to articulate the range of knowledge, skills, and abilities required to effectively use primary sources. They defined primary source literacy as the combination of knowledge, skills, and abilities necessary to effectively find, interpret, evaluate, and ethically use primary sources within specific disciplinary contexts in order to create new knowledge or to revise existing understandings. And that will be the longest quote that I read to you during the course of this, I promise. In other words, the guidelines go through the goals of being able to navigate archives, but also how to sort through information in any context. And hopefully you can see how this would be a valuable skill for students to gain and work on. Guidelines define 4 core ideas: analytical concepts, interrogating context, format, creator. How do you analyze the actual information that is in a record? Ethical concepts, copyright, context, donor agreement. How am I able to legally and ethically use this? Theoretical concepts, evidence, historical empathy, power, mediation. How do those affect how I react to the document, and how do those affect the very creation of the document itself? And practical considerations, finding and handling. Do I have to travel to an archive? Is it available digitally? And if I get a rare book, please don't wave it around in the air. You may recognize these in sum as the skills necessary to use archives or any set of documents for historical research. The guidelines also define several broad learning objective categories, which represent conceptual goals of a lesson, presented in sort of a contextless environment. As someone planning lessons, one or few of these should be used to build a lesson around. They fall under 5 categories: conceptualize, find and access, read, understand, and summarize, interpret, analyze, and evaluate, and use and incorporate. Under each of these, there are some sub-goals to go and make a little bit clearer what they're discussing. And it's actually useful if you see some of the guidelines referenced in other documents that they all have individual letters and numbers. So for example, 4B is a more specific sub-goal. As some examples here, under conceptualize, one of the guidelines is, one of the learning objectives is articulate what might serve as a primary source for a specific research project within the framework of an academic discipline or area of study. In other words, be able to identify a primary source within a certain context. That's a very specific and practical goal. Under find and access, one of the sub-goals is identify the possible locations of primary sources. Do I have to travel, or is it available digitally, for example? Under read, understand, and summarize, there is understand that a primary source may exist in a variety of iterations, including excerpts, transcriptions, and translations. Under interpret, analyze, and evaluate, one of them is demonstrate historical empathy, curiosity about the past, and appreciation for historical sources. And lastly, under use and incorporate, there is examine and synthesize a variety of sources in order to construct, support, or dispute a research argument and historical actors. In other words, what are ways to go and understand the information that is being presented to you and to truly think critically about what it is saying? But again, the pilot year, we kind of ignored those guidelines. And as we looked to hold sessions of the JHI program for a second year, I began to see far more opportunity to really engage the students through primary sources and teach genuine historical skills that would be useful both for the JHI activities and in their growth. The result, as I could see them during the second year, saw students that were far more engaged and truly grappling with what it took to do history. My colleagues running the JHI program confirmed that they saw significantly more growth in their students as they interacted with visitors and completed the program. I can also say that we have expanded the program in the third year. We're now include another semester of archival workshops with some of the now high school students. They started as middle schoolers, now they're high schoolers. As well as we now put on a few teaching sessions a year with some museum volunteers and docents, as well as with some sisters who live here on campus. All in all, the fine tuning and refinement was a very successful step to take and allowed us to expand the program to more students and to seek other ways to branch out for teaching sessions. One moment. A few keys to good archival sessions. The key and biggest distinction between impactful and unimpactful sessions that I've found comes from incorporation of students into the learning process. There's two principles that I'd like to bring up from some of the dense, long, and occasionally boring educational theory: active learning and constructivist learning. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, but I'm going to give them distinct definitions here. First is active learning, which utilizes an activity in the learning process. And the second is constructivist learning that allows the students to construct their own knowledge. You can see that chat, can't you? In constructivist learning, things are not spelled out to students and they are guided rather than instructed on how to pull the pieces together, sort of like archival research. I admit that at one time I did neither. I now aim for the latter, and sometimes I end up settling for the former. Both of these contrast with passive learning, which tends to follow more sage on the stage style absorption of information models. In terms of designing sessions, a simple model is that of backwards design, in which a teacher starts with a learning outcome and a way to measure it, then utilizes an activity which leads toward the learning outcome. Sort of like when they give you advice on how to write a short story or a novel and think of the ending first, it kind of works the same way. So if you and your teaching partner have a goal in mind, you can use your knowledge of the collections to know the materials that will help them bring toward that outcome. You start with an outcome, you have the materials, and you can sort of figure out the steps that fall in between. I'll offer some examples here. The first session that I always do with the middle schoolers for the year involves the ability to read and access historical documents and information. This connects with the JHI program's goals of conveying the importance of penmanship, diary keeping, and other aspects of early 19th century education, particularly for girls. In this case, that would be our learning outcome. I sort of start with the example of the Rosetta Stone, ask a few intro little questions. I picked the Rosetta Stone because it's something that's easy to find a picture of and something that the students likely have a little bit of familiarity with, discuss why it's important, and then draw on the connection between the ability to understand or translate, air quotes, materials. I then provide some handwritten documents and allow students to work in small groups to decipher the cursive. And for the record, the document on the left there, I believe, is a piece of writing from one of St. Elizabeth's children. And on the right is a scan that we had available of the St. Elizabeth letter. I don't know if we ever used this one or if we picked one that was a little bit neater. You can see some of the bleed through on the paper, unfortunately, with that one. I stay on hand to assist with handling of the documents and to point out a few tips and tricks. The document choice is important on this front, not just ensuring that the document is in good shape for handling, but that it is something we have a transcription of in order to illustrate the ways that using documents can be difficult, but also be made much easier, and even connect this to other types of records like film or the digital realm. So doing this as an intro allows us to talk about the flexibility of records. It allows the students an activity. They go and try to read a document And then when you go and hand them the transcription, they can sort of, their eyes light up a little bit and see, oh, this is much, much easier. I see how this process can be made much, much easier with some level of substitute or intervention in between me and the document. Another example here, and this points to ways to plan activities. Pairs, small groups, and large group projects are your friend. Instead of needing to pull 10 boxes or 10 collections or 10 items, think about ways that can pull 4 or 5 folders or 4 or 5 small items. It also forces students to collaborate in some shared task with each other, reinforces the idea that interpretation is a group activity and is in fact collaborative, rather than that image of the lone scholar in a room. In this activity, I use a series of prayer cards related to St. Elizabeth. These are just a few of them. There are more. They are in no order, chronologically or by subject, which is for once a good thing. And it lets me sort of place them on a large table with 8 or so students around it. And I sort of say, put them in order and see what they come up with. It allows me to ask questions at the end that forces them to explain their collective reasoning and what questions their order allows someone to answer, which, by the way, matches with Primary Source Guideline 2C, draw on primary sources to generate and refine research questions. Based on their responses to my questions and some other selective inquiries, I can then ask them to redo the exercise based on the questions that they would like to come up with, or come up with different questions that better suit their own system. And I have to say, that moment where you go and say, and they go and explain all their reasoning, that moment where you go and say, do it again, that's also another really, really fun moment to sort of see them realize, oh, I have to rethink all my own thinking now. That's always a fun moment. I like that one. Determining a learning outcome is something that should be done with some consultation between you and your teaching partner. If your teaching partner is not quite sure what the purpose of the session is, feel free to inquire, push, or ask for a syllabus. We all took a general reference course in library school. Use some of those reference desk skills in this area. A single session is not the time to pile on facts or try and teach every single factoid. Learning objectives should be straightforward and limited, 3 at most, and often it's less. For this example, we ask the JHI students to accurately and plausibly interpret the lives of students at St. Joseph's Academy. And the way we do it in this one, we get some of these surviving scrapbooks from different time periods. They're often photo heavy. We don't want to focus too much on handwriting in this case. And so this is a page from one of the scrapbooks. It's a little weird because it's wide for the image. So you can see there's some family photos and a parkland scene, or a campus scene. And I believe this is around the 1890s. This is an image from that session. We didn't have pictures taken in every single session, but this is one of some of the students at work handling one of the old scrapbooks. But based on the scrapbook, the students are asked to come up with a plausible story of a student, either real or an archetype, which is a tie-in to the JHI program's expectation of students participating in living history. I specifically include this lesson in this presentation because this is one that I was not quite satisfied with, and I definitely need to rethink in the future. Some of the students' stories were pretty, we'll say, imaginative. I attempted to provide some gentle correction and suggestions. I pointed out the need to include both what we know about specific individuals and what we know about life in general in this time period. But all in all, I do have some hesitation over whether or not my learning objective was met in this session. Another aspect of session design is creating something measurable. In many school and university settings, the archivist is often not around for the end measurement of a course, but that does not mean that there cannot be end goals to an individual session. So The archivist is usually not in the room when the final project gets turned in or for the final test. At the same time, an archival session is not a place where there's supposed to be a test. And I fully come clean that the measurement part is something that is one of the most difficult for me to do in terms of session design. In the last example that I gave there, the student stories that they came up with were a form of assessment, which helped me to realize that my learning objectives may not have been met and that they need to be re-examined. This is an image from another activity from a different session. The students worked as a class. They had a blank whiteboard to work on. That was their canvas, and there were a few artifacts and photographs that were pulled. The class was instructed to utilize the materials and create the layout of an exhibit panel on some topic of their choosing. I facilitated the use of the artifacts and the documents and was on hand if things went off the rails, but the class itself had relatively free rein on what they wanted to talk about in their exhibit. The point where there was an assessment came when I asked them, walk me through what you have. I offered my own input and my own suggestions on improvements and asked questions. But rather than create individual narrative stories, I could use that assessment to see students gathering big picture ideas and report that back to the interpreters running the JHI program. And so there was clearly a hands-on activity. There was clearly a collaborative effort. They had a final product to create, and I could go and sort of push and pull on their explanations to see how well they understood what I was trying to get through and what the JHI interpreters were trying to get through. I'm also going to give my sidebar here on lesson planning. This obviously relates to learners who are in traditional classroom age. When you're not working with learners in that age range, that can create some differences in lesson planning when compared to school age or college age students. We tend to think of adults as a little bit more prone to boredom tolerance. So I know many lessons for adult learners end up being a little less interactive. I am of the personal opinion that that should be both acceptable to a point and avoided to a point. For example, I'm going to bring up here one of the sessions with the museum docents. The session was on rare book use and handling. So the lesson held a period of instruction and demonstration on things to be aware of when handling rare books, but mostly the session consisted of docents getting to interact with rare books and have a good time doing it. It did not exactly incorporate a measurement other than ensuring that they were not being overly damaging to the books. Along those lines, I hope there was longitudinal retention, but I honestly can't say for sure. And I don't quite know how much of a lead you should follow on that. I'm open to any suggestions you have, but I'm throwing that out there as something that I have a little bit of mixed feelings on. There's some literature, professional literature on adult learners. It is significantly more scarce than K through 12, and certainly more scarce than university age students. But that's a sidebar. A few things to consider. What amount of time can you invest into a teaching program? This question relates both to how many sessions and what types of programming you are capable of. To design a teaching session for the first time can take work, and it can even take time to pull together materials for a session. That being said, if you have an activity that works well, you can substitute in new materials. And if you repeat the same lesson, it can be used over and over again with only minor tweaks. You can build up a course catalog book is what I'm getting at. And once you have that built up, you can cruise a little bit. What types of teaching relationships are you looking for? It still takes time at the beginning to design a new session. A bigger question might be, are you exclusively looking for partners for one-shot sessions, which occur only once in a class, or for something a little bit more long-term? I'm currently holding up to 6 to 8 sessions with the same groups every single year. So this becomes a little bit more consistent of a time commitment. At the same time, I can start to get to know the students and they can start to get to know me a little bit. And so I start to learn what are the things that they react well to, what are the things that they have some difficulty with. And I've never ever done something like an embedded archivist in a classroom or a co-teacher scenario, which carries with it their own other responsibilities. I'm not giving a grade at the end of a course. And if you're in a co-teaching scenario, that might conceivably be something that's part of it. How much time are you able to dedicate to teaching? All of us are stretched thin. We all know this. If you can take on a few one-shot sessions, and as much as you would like to do more extended teaching experiences, and you just can't right now, you know what? That's perfectly fine. Not everyone is in a situation where that's in the cards, or can make that happen, or has the staffing to make that happen. What I am saying is that it makes for good optics, good relationship building, and we'll see big, big returns on outreach efforts. A lot of the literature, again, particularly directed toward university archivists, advocates for constantly reaching out and looking for new teaching partners. I'm not trying to decry that, but sometimes that's just not in the cards. And it really just isn't, especially if you're, say, an underfunded Lone Ranger. How are you, if at all, incorporating technology into your teaching? I will also say that it is eminently possible to hold active learning sessions online. At the beginning of the pandemic, when everyone was caught flat-footed and really just trying to keep things afloat, particularly in schools and in higher education, sessions with archives very much dropped off the radar. We're 2.5 years into this almost. We have had time to figure these things out. I assure you, you can do active learning sessions remotely over Zoom. It is possible. It sounds wild. It is possible. It does relate to what situation you are in relation to what is digitized and available. In a purely virtual situation, you may have to provide documents beforehand for students to read or watch or listen to, or undertake some quick digitization for access copies for a new lesson. Think pair shares, breakout rooms, virtual whiteboard spaces, questionnaires, keyword search creation, in some cases, object and document interrogation, can all be in play if you have a little bit of digitization time or a few things digitized already. These are activities that can work very, very well. What are your space restrictions? How many people fit in your reading room? Can you afford to shut your reading room down for an afternoon? Are teaching sessions going to be limited to days when you are close to researchers? Do you have another space available? Are you willing to travel with teaching materials or artifacts? Can teaching with Zoom ameliorate some of those questions? Should you use originals or reproductions? That's sort of the age-old question of archives. I've spoken to archivists who exclusively use reproductions and some who exclusively use originals. My experiences with middle and high schoolers show that they very, very much value the sense of originality. But you definitely have to offer some correction and light reprimand sometimes for mishandling of materials. It sort of points to, again, why you need to think about what you're going to use. But then again, I've had to reprimand adults for misusing materials in the research room as well. So, you know, sort of worked out the same. I also do not work with elementary school children, or at least I have not yet. That almost certainly would change my calculus on the subject. I once spoke with an archivist at a regional historical society who would do lessons on maps in teaching sessions with elementary school kids. And she would hold the sessions outside so that the students could see the map and the exact land and the area that the maps depicted. The mix of outside and elementary school kids meant that she absolutely did not use originals in that activity. Relations with partners. In almost every teaching scenario, an archivist will have some coordinating partner, whether it's a teacher, a professor, or a coordinator of some group. There will likely be some scenarios where that's not the case, particularly with adult learners, but statistically will be far less frequent. The goal that an archivist should strive for in their relationship with a teaching partner is one of mutual respect and ability to describe and dictate to each other your objectives and goals of a lesson. There are many, many horror stories out there of professors using archivists as babysitters for a day while they go out of town. Frankly, if they're not going to stay in the room, don't let them be in the room. That's my advice. Partner collaboration is key. Make sure you know what your goals, your targets, and your ideas are on both ends. Make sure you know how archives fits into your collaborators' broader themes and lesson plans, and make sure they know that there's an expectation of active engagement. Your collaborator will not always know what is in your archive. So that might require some education for your collaborator as well, even just as a preparatory for a teaching session. But a worthwhile teaching partner will approach you with an open mind and hopefully hear out your suggestion and respect you as a subject expert on your collections. I will also say that literature recommends being proactive in seeking out your teaching partners and to be constantly reaching out. Again, sometimes that's just not possible, especially if you're an underfunded loan arranger. I did want to include some useful resources here. These are two books that I turn to a lot. And this one I will give you a moment to go and pull out your phone and snap a picture of this. On the left is a book called Using Primary Sources. Contains a whole bunch of sample exercises that are easily adaptable for different audiences and different scopes and scales and types of collections. Yes, that is my personal copy, and you can see all my little sticky notes sticking out of the top there. And the one on the right is a general guide to a very, very good guide to education in a library or archive setting in general. Snapshots of Reality by Mary Snyder Broussard, Rachel Hickhoff Cresco, and Jessica Urk Oberlin. Again, there's a chapter there with a lot of very good recommendations and good models to build a teaching session off of. Hope everybody snapped a picture if you were trying to take one. This is a LibGuide out of McMaster University Library. Again, contains even more lesson ideas and places to jump off of in order to get lesson ideas. People are very creative. We don't live in a vacuum. Build off people's work. This is one from Kevin Yee, who is the director of student teaching education, I believe, some title like that. Director of Academy for Teaching and Learning Excellence at the University of South Florida. This is 280 different techniques, different types of instructional settings, wide range of ages. And I even think this gets updated, so I think it's even more than 280 by now. But that's definitely a bookmark that I have and one that I come back to fairly frequently. Some of the biggest archival organizations like NARA and the Library of Congress have some teaching packages available for various subjects. They may not necessarily relate or be marketed specifically toward religious collections, but they can be useful to make you think about how to teach, how to supplement your own archival materials, or to inspire lesson plans from similar documents in your own collections. This is the case studies series on teaching with primary sources, which is out of the reference access and outreach section of SAA. There's 30-some case studies now that deal in, again, various situations. Most of them are geared toward universities, although not all of them. I know the one of the ones that I was most impressed with here uses archives to teach math. I would have never thought of that. That blows me away. I'm very impressed by that. I'm also including here a resource from the University of Michigan to assess teaching. This is a site that offers a number of toolkits on collecting archival statistics and measuring archival effectiveness. They happen to have one for teaching. I think that some of them can be a little bit too high-minded in some ways and overplay the feasibility of conducting some of their types of formal assessment. But nonetheless, I wanted to point it out to reinforce the importance of assessment, reinforce sometimes the difficulty of creating a type of assessment, and really stick it in your heads and my own that it should be part of planning out your teaching and getting you toward your learning objectives. In terms of learning about teaching and lesson design, obviously SAA and our various regional organizations have courses and workshops on the subject. I'm also going to highlight the Teaching with Primary Sources Collective, or TPS. They put on an unconference every year, which actually just occurred last week, that very much focuses on the practical ways in which archivists create, teach, and promote principles of inclusion in the classroom. It's also very useful that a number of K through 12 educators are usually in some of those sessions. And the fact that it's an unconference, what they mean by that is that it's a lot more free flowing. It's a lot more focused on discussion between the people who show up in the Zoom rooms. So actually hearing directly from K through 12 educators who are in the classroom far, far more than I am and that a lot of archivists are is very, very useful. And of course, I'm going to push the SAA primary source literacy guidelines one more time. I'm going to leave this up for a few seconds if you want to take a phone picture. And with that, I'm going to say thank you all, and I wish you all the very, very best of luck. Teaching is really hard. It started out as something that I truly found very draining. I don't find it draining anymore. And the fact that I get excited for teaching sessions and get a chance to really see a new group of kids that are interested in what I have to say and are interested in historical documents is probably one of the most rewarding parts of my job. So I will leave it at that. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take some.
Thank you, Scott. So I have one question in the chat so far, and I wanted to, you were mentioning, whether to use original documents or reproductions. And something that I have at our historical society, and I've seen at museums a little bit more than kind of libraries and archives, is education collections. So I actually recently received a donation that really has to do with our community, but doesn't really fit within our collecting interest, and nobody else really wants it. And I think I'm going to turn it into something that looks very much like an archival collection that kids can, learn to handle, and we're not concerned about what happens to it. So I think that's a kind of interesting approach too, that you can use, where you have original material, but it's not part of your collection.
I think that's so I have to say that I am not a fan of taking materials that are outside of my institution's collecting policy.
Mm-hmm.
In general. Try not to do that, because then you end up as just dumping ground for anything.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, that's a good way to expose students to original materials.
Yeah.
Don't devote tons and tons of shelf space to it, please. But I think that's a good way to keep students engaged and kind of to keep on the good side with whoever your donor is on that front. Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. So the question I have is about, I guess, the prior knowledge of students coming in for a teaching experience. So it says, how much context do your students generally have for the subject matter or the concept of a primary source / documentary forms in general before they engage in activities? I feel like the activities are much more successful with more context, but don't want information transfer to take up activities.
I think that's something that you need to work with your teaching partner on. I did make an assumption with the Rosetta Stone. I did make an assumption there, and I probably shouldn't have. I should have probably cleared that with somebody first. It just happened to work out okay for me. I think that's part of the collaborative piece that you need to have with your teaching partner. If they are a classroom teacher, they're going to know what their students know better than you. Again, I'm dealing with middle schoolers who are either voluntarily or forced by their parents into an after-school history museum activity. So I have a little bit more freedom on that assumption. If I was working with a public school, which I would like to do, I don't know that I would rely as fully on that assumption without getting some confirmation first.
Great. So we do have some more time for questions. If anyone has more questions. I don't have any right now. Oh, okay. We got a follow-up. Okay. So related to that question, do you provide the information to the teaching partner or help them identify resources that would be helpful to your activities? So I guess this is asking if you were to ask a teaching partner to provide more information ahead of time, would you give them what you want them to show the students, or would you more help them to identify resources that would be helpful to the activities you're planning to do?
I would probably say the second one, I think, if I'm understanding the question correctly. Again, I would, based on the teaching partner's goals and
Right.
whatever their learning objectives are, I would think, and of course, based on whatever level of course we're doing, think through what collections would be of worth. I've had scenarios where my primary teaching partners had ideas of what collections, and I've sort of said, like, that's fine. I will do that if you really, really want me to. I also have another idea and another collection that I think could work far, far better. So I think it's part of that give and take. Sometimes they might have preconceived notions about what is in your archive. Sometimes the preconceived notions will be correct and you can go ahead with minimal problems. And sometimes you might have a suggestion to say, hey, I have a better idea here. I have another collection that might be useful, or another set of material that might be useful to get across the same point that you're trying to get to.
Okay, so in the context of that question, it sounds like you're saying that you want to be, it's part of the collaborative nature of the activity with the teaching partner, and that you would want to try to avoid being directive with, like, this is the information that you should give your students, and more finding resources that they can choose from, or them leading, like, this is the kind of information that we want to communicate, and them having options of how to do that.
Sure, exactly. So I'll give another little bit of advice here too. Pictures are fun. People like pictures. Things that have pictures on them and fewer words. People like those. In general, students don't want to read. Sometimes they do. Those are weird kids. Anything on visual literacy, or that can be eye-catching or unique, students tend to react very, very well to those type of things. And pictures are also, or primarily image-based materials are also something, if you do want to go with the reproduction route, can be reproduced far quicker and far easier in a lot of cases.
And actually connecting photos and reproductions of photos back to the education collection idea. I don't know if anybody else experiences this, but I keep getting donations of reproductions of things that came out of our collection, of our photograph collection. And this is kind of a local history organization problem, I think. So, like, I get donations of calendars, and all of the photos in the calendars were reproduced from our collection. And then people will, like, return reproductions that they received for some reason. And so I just put those into the education collection. And, it looks like a a photo print. So to a kid, like it's an original material. And it's a really great thing that they can handle and look at. And there's a variety, you know, based on what people are just asking for. So that's that's an easy way to do it too. Yeah.
Mary Grace did send me a direct message, so I am going to address this. In the Teaching with Primary Sources case study series, I did write one of the case studies on the first 2 years of the collaboration with the JHI program. I was trying not to go and plug my own material too much, but Mary Grace is encouraging me to. So I did write an article. I hope you enjoy it and can get something out of it. Scroll down, it's number 28 or something like that.
Excellent. So I don't have any more questions in the Q&A. We have, you know, a little more time if anybody wants to throw anything in there. I will plug our next few sessions that the Models and Resources Committee of the Religious Collections section is hosting. So we have one next week on the 19th. That's a collection sharing collection highlights from the Diocese of San Jose. And we have a lunch and learn like this coming up on September 2nd, which is about reference services. And that's with someone who works at Santa Clara University. Yeah, those are our next two sessions. Oh, okay, sorry, yes. So there's an archival chat, which is a more of a dialogue on August 19th about processing unprocessed collections. It's not a collections highlight session. So, I mean, that's useful for everyone. And then the next lunch and learn is reference services, which is often, you know, under discussed how to do reference. So I think we will wrap up and end the session since I don't have any more questions. So thank you so much, Scott. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you for your questions. And please look out for our upcoming sessions.
Thank you very much.